Hello, my name is Devin Canada, and I've never made a YouTube video before. Never thought about making a YouTube video before. It's never even reached my mind to ever make a YouTube video before. My purpose for making this video, though, is that I saw a narrative being repeated over and over and over again that I've seen no justification for. And the narrative is simply this: that the English colonists in Virginia, when they had captured Pocahontas, that she was raped. This narrative I have seen some counters for, but none on a social media station. And yet I've seen this narrative repeated over and over again on a social media station. Whether it be YouTube or Facebook or Adam Knows Everything, Adam Ruins Everything, it has been repeated over and over and over again. Yet where does it come from? Why has it not been discussed before now? And the truth is that this narrative has never been publicly put out, never been seen by anybody until 2007. In 2007, there was this book published out. It's called The True Story of Pocahontas. It's written by Dr. Linwood Costello and Angela L. Daniel. And it claims to come from the oral history of the Montepone. Sorry if I mispronounced the tribe's name. I've only read it. I've never heard it pronounced. And it claims to be from the 400-year-old oral tradition of the tribe. Now this is where I want to put up my first red flag. Why was it never written before 2007? Ask yourself this. This is something that makes this really doubtful. This had 400 years, according to the back of the book, to be written, yet it was never written. An oral tradition has a lot of time to be compromised, even at the best oral historians. It has a lot of time to be compromised. So my first argument against this narrative is probably the biggest one. What has taken place in that 400 years? This is being told through the mouths of narrators. If it was 400 years, which there's even some doubt that this oral tradition even goes back that far. We don't even know. We're taking Linwood's word on it. That is 400 years. And why was it not published over that time? So, kind of looking back, this could have been published in the 1800s. In the 1800s, there was the autobiography of Black Hawk. In that autobiography, we discovered that Black Hawk's rebellion was caused by a white flag violation. Not done by Native Americans, but done by Americans. It became a shockwave throughout the country because they discovered an outrage that the white flag was violated. At this time period, if Pocahontas was raped, if all these things that were done against the early Powhatan Confederacy, they had an ample time to publish the oral tradition and say, hey, Pocahontas was raped. Our wives were raped. The English settlers were horrible to us. Just as bad as they were to Black Hawk's people when they shot him. Shot members of his tribe during a white flag. Not once, but twice. But yeah, we were raped. Why didn't they do it then? Or what about in the 1900s? In the 1900s, there was a great curiosity about Native Americans, and it was growing. By the time 1940s come around, there was many movies that got rid of the cowboys good, Indians bad narrative. Why not then? Or why not in the 1970s? Even. That still would have been hard to believe. But yet, it waited until 2007. 2007 is when we first hear about this. Why not earlier? They had... Their tribe would have known how to read and write by that point. They would have known how to read and write before 1900. They were an Eastern tribe. The second point about this being 400 years, what all has taken place in that time period? What all did any narrators would have seen? They would have seen multiple things. After the American Revolution, you saw the first instances of Native Americans being forced off their land, as you saw with Black Hawk's people. You saw later on, or even before that, up in the north in Massachusetts with King Philip's War. There became those saying, the only good Indian's a dead Indian from that war. These people would have saw racism during that time. What about in the 1700s? During the French and American War. Or the French and Indian War, sorry. Where Indians, tribes on both sides of the line fought against each other and with one another, and soldiers saw Indians fight alongside them or against them. Then in the 1800s, during Jackson's presidency, when you saw the Indian Removal Act, a heinous crime done against Native Americans. These narrators for the Powhatan Confederacy would have been witness to these events, heard about them, knew about them. They would have known about what happened to the Sioux way back west. And at times they would have felt prejudice against them, and at other times just out of pure heat for being a conquered people. They would have been just angry. You had a lot of time for bitterness to unfold, a lot of time for anger to take place, and a lot of time for the narrative, the oral tradition, if it even existed that far back, to be compromised. And then you even go even further up. We are now in the 2000s, where we are in a period where red man good, white man bad. That's the constant narrative, no matter what war. Whether it be the war against the Dakotas, or the wars against the Comanche, or the wars against the Apache, or the wars against the Aztec. No matter who a white person is fighting, if they are Native Americans, the Native Americans are automatically placed as the good guys in today's narrative. That's just the way the narrative goes. And it's largely because as humans, we like to look at things in a black and white notion. So this kind of has become a time period to where you can really say anything bad about English colonists, Western settlers, conquistadors, and get away with it, and people will believe it because they want to. That's just the way it is. The other points, well, before I get to that other point, let me bring the conclusion on this one. You had 400 years, according to Linwood. That is 400 years of bitterness to sink in. 400 years for the narrative to go down. And you had 400 years to write it down. And yet it wasn't written down. The next point. The book itself makes a lot of narratives that contradict the character or flat out does not make sense about the people it's talking about. One of the first things I spotted in this book was that John Smith, according to this book by Linwood and Angela, he would go into a tribe with his gun, and he would point his gun up to the head of the chief, hold him hostage, demand all the food, and then somehow miraculously he throws a bunch of beads on the floor and claims he traded. It says it twice in this book that he did that. The second time it mentions it, it says that the reason why he did this is to tell his fellow colonists that he's traded. Why would he need to do that? What's the point? He could have just said, oh, the Indians gave us a gift. There was no point in doing the trade at that point. He already got what he wanted. There's no point. If he had everybody covering for him, all the people that were guarding him were willing to lie for him as well, there's no point in throwing the beads down. This puts this story as very doubtful right off the bat, and it tells me that the oral history is full of doubtful stories. Then it goes on. The character of Powhatan in Linwood's tale is very unjustified. Let me give you a point, okay? When it comes to John Smith, you just heard what I just said about John Smith according to Linwood. If what he says is true about John Smith, then why is Linwood also denying that Powhatan ever wanted John Smith executed? There's no point in denying that story because Powhatan had every reason to. Instead, he has Powhatan treat him as a kind person, as his best chief, favorite chief. There's no point. If the English display Powhatan as a good leader, a foreign leader, who they often had conflicts with and peace with, both. The tradition of the Anglican narrative, which is written down in many letters and books, has Powhatan as not really a bad guy, but a leader who not always understood them. They have him a lot more complex than Linwood does, than the Linwood's claim of the oral tradition having. I'll give you another one, another thing in the book that truly contradicts character. And I'll use it kind of to lead up to the main issue that kind of started this video. Linwood claims in the book that the English settlers would rape the women and the children and enslave the children of the Powhatan Confederacy. Yet, this does not make a lick of sense to the rest of his narrative. Once again, he makes Powhatan out as weak. Powhatan doesn't respond with war. Let me tell you what the English felt about Powhatan, and here's the simple truth. Powhatan had more numbers than the English settlers. The musket took longer to load than it took for the arrows. In particular, the muskets that they had. They had inferior muskets to what we often even see and hear about today. Most of the muskets we hear about today are kind of like your American Revolution War muskets and Civil War muskets, which could go a lot further distance and were a little bit more stronger. What these English settlers had were inferior weaponry. Powhatan Confederacy had more numbers, more trained warriors. They had the ability to move faster. Even when the Powhatan Confederacy reached the shore to where the cannons of the English came of use, the superior numbers and the speed alone gave Powhatan the edge. That's the reason why the English feared them. So if that happened, if the English were raping the women, raping the children, kidnapping the children, why wouldn't Powhatan respond? Any other good leader, especially the type of leader that the English portray Powhatan as, would have raised up his entire country to drive them out. All of it. He would have listened to his brother. His brother didn't like the English. When he died and his brother took control, he declared war on the English. But Powhatan didn't. Powhatan wanted to have a kind of a alliance with them. But nobody's going to hold into alliance with somebody that's raping your women and children. Nobody. They were not like that to where they could allow that. And this brings up the main point. The kidnapping of Pocahontas. The reason why they kidnapped Pocahontas was they couldn't go into straight-out war with Powhatan because they would lose. They wanted to bring back English captives and guns by holding her hostage. So they did it by a ruse. They actually got some of her friends to lead her onto the boat, and then they locked her up. The claim is then that she was manipulated and raped. So let's talk about a bit about the accusations a little further. And I'm sorry, I don't have a script with this, so I didn't write this down. I didn't write down what I was going to say. I'm trying to do everything off the top of my head. I only wrote down a few questions that I had. Their claim is that Pocahontas was raped, yet the English purpose of kidnapping her was to safely get back captives, guns. They did not want war with Powhatan because they would lose. If they had violated Pocahontas or hurt her, they would risk ending that peace right away. This is the argument that most historians are against this place out. If she was raped, the peace would have been violated. The whole purpose would have been over. But Linwood claims that in their tradition, in the Montapone tradition, she was raped. More so that when she was raped, she conceived child. That this child ended up being Thomas Rolfe. Okay? Then they go on to claim that she was in her first trimester and that they had to put her in English clothes to hide the pregnancy. Now, if these Englishmen were out there raping native women, why would they need to hide it? Why would they need to hide her pregnancy? Why? They even go on to say, in the book, it goes along with the narrative that is somewhat believed by English and is definitely believed by the native people, that she was priorly married. Why would they need to cover up the pregnancy at all? They could have said that it was her husband's child. Why? And if it was because it was so late in captivity, which being first trimester and they wanted to rush a wedding is the likely story that they're trying to bring about, why would they need to hide this from rapists? Why? And then they go on and they don't really say that Thomas Dale is the father, but they theorize that Thomas Dale is the father. Now, here's a little bit about Thomas Dale. Thomas Dale is kind of your easy-to-pick-on guy. He's kind of your Richard Nixon of the colony. He was ruthless, a tyrant. But let's look at some of the laws that he had. One of the laws that he had was that the death penalty would be for any man who committed adultery. Why would a man who raped a woman have that type of law? Wouldn't he fear rebellion or backlash? I mean, the colonists were armed. Think about that for a moment. He had laws. Death penalty for adultery. Death penalty for things like rape. He had death penalty just for stealing a bit of corn. This man was ruthless. I have serious doubts that a man who has the death penalty for adultery would rape Pocahontas. And I seriously doubt that a man who would even be feared enough to get away with it would have to hide it. I doubt that completely. And then comes the next part of this. There are accusations against John Rolfe. John Rolfe, when he went into the settlement, he was a widower of 4 years. He lost his wife and child in Bermuda. And he sort of took up the time to teach Pocahontas Christianity and educate her. He went through all the works and effort. According to John Rolfe's letter that he wrote to Thomas Dale, is that during his time of educating her, he was falling in love with her. And he doesn't say this in like a flat-out lazy term like, I love this girl. He says it in a very romantic, robust term. Okay? He says about Pocahontas, referring to Pocahontas, to whom my heart and best thoughts are, and have a long time been so entangled and enthralled in so intricate a labyrinth. That was kind of a romantic poise back then. This man wrote Thomas Dale basically for permission to marry Pocahontas because he was finding himself falling in love with her. Linwood's book denies this. It says that the reason why John Rolfe married her was for tobacco. Basically to learn how to better produce tobacco from her people. Basically for political reasons and business reasons. But here's the thing. No man who is wanting to work politically would write his governor for permission to marry a girl. And he wrote this letter in a very cautious way. He put it forth as if he was doing this for the sake of the whole plantation, the whole area. And if you read his letter, he basically puts Christianity as his reason. And if you understand who he's writing it to, you'll understand why. He's writing it to Thomas Dale, who was kind of a guy who was just all business. Remember, he's the guy who was whipping that place into shape. He was a tyrant who would kill people for stealing a little bit of corn. So, yeah. He was being very cautious in the letter. So for this little part to come out, this little part of emotion to come out, to say that I am so entangled with her, and so intricate a labyrinth, this is kind of a show of emotion in that little bitty spot. An emotion that he probably couldn't really hide, and he was trying to hide it. And so, to say that John Rolfe married her for just pure business reasons, I don't find that likely at all. Now I'm going to present my last argument. I call this the weakest argument that I have. The reason why it's the weakest argument I have is because of dates. The marriage of John Rolfe to Pocahontas took place on April 5th, 1614. And the tradition is that, I don't know if I could really say this is a tradition. According to Helen Roundtree, we don't know what date Thomas Rolfe was born. But his tombstone says 1615. Everything that I could find says January 30th, 1615. Now, my argument against Miss Roundtree, who's definitely way superior a historian on this than me, is very simple. Thomas Rolfe had a long time to learn his own birthday. I tend to believe that the date on that tombstone is accurate. 1615. Now, if Pocahontas was pre-maritally pregnant, first trimester, when she married John Rolfe, to the point where they noticed, which let us assume would be month 2 or month 3 of the pregnancy, and that from there the child was born in 1615, January 30th, that is a really long pregnancy. We're talking about a pregnancy of about 11 months to 12 months. That's a bit much. Yes, there was late-term pregnancies back then, but that long is a bit much. I find just based on that is very unlikely that Pocahontas was ever raped. It's more likely that the English tradition is more accurate. Whether you say that she got Stockholm Syndrome and that's why she liked being with the English, or if she was relatively and really truly curious and just grew with them, I find that her being raped is just so unlikely, and that these accusations are really based more on emotion. 400 years of emotion. That's all. That's what that tradition is. If it wasn't an emotion, it would have been written down way earlier than 2007. One thing that we should always be careful of is just accepting a oral tradition right at point blank. Our oral tradition deserves to be questioned. Always. Even when we take a great faith in it. We should always judge it and say, what happened in that time period? Is there any writing to collaborate with? What is written does not agree with Linwood's tale. The other things that I would like to point out is that someone might ask, why would Pocahontas marry a man if she was already married? Linwood claims that the husband was killed. And I've read another book that says that the laws of Powhatan's Confederacy, that is, if a girl is captured, the divorce is considered already done. So if she was married, by her capture, she was already divorced. And so, in her laws, that was a divorce, being captured. And the man moved on and he married somebody else. The other thing to consider, though, is that there's no real true agreement, no hardcore evidence that she was ever married before John Rolfe. So there's pretty good chance that she never was. So I just wanted to fill that in there now that I'm towards the end here. I'm sorry this is so long. This is a lot of meat to kind of pull apart, kind of debone. The I hope, though, that this can open up a lot of people's minds to realize that sometimes what you're hearing all around you is just a narrative that's not being questioned. But this is one that deserves to be questioned. Every time you hear history being portrayed out, check the sources. Look it up. Read what the original works had to say. And take a peek at it. I know this video is not very good. I apologize. I've never made a YouTube video before. I only made this video because I saw nobody else countering this. And I really hope this encourages other people to also research this and also do their own counters or defenses. You have a good day.